Welcome to the first episode of our series on youth at the crossroads, as we explore the impact of recent events serving to shape the concerns and aspirations of our youth, the next generation. Each of the 5 webinars will engage our newly formed youth advisory panel for digging deeper into the recent impacts of COVID, overprotection, social media, and artificial intelligence, concluding with an episode on governance and where from here. COVID mandates, mindful neglect explores the impact of the man-made COVID mandates on our youth. What if the greatest harm to our youth wasn't the virus itself, but the mindless masking and isolation or silence? COVID mandates has explored how well-intentioned policies sidelined a generation, forcing the resilience where support was needed. It's time to reckon with the cost of caution and the voices we fail to hear. So without further ado, I'm going to pose questions to each of the panelists. My first question to you, as our youth panel, stretching over several years, stretching over multiple experiences, ethnicity differences. We've got quite diversity in the panel. So my first question is about silent classrooms and loud consequences. Many of you were in school or just starting post-secondary or just finishing it, which is the case, Emerson, when the lockdowns hit. Looking back, what specific moment or experience during the pandemic made you feel most disconnected from your own development, whether academically, socially, or emotionally? And what helped you get through it? Or what was missing that could have helped? So this is an opportunity for you to just share with us a little bit of your own personal experience, that moment when something happened that might have been unexpected. Anyone want to jump in and get this thing started? Otherwise, I'll call on you.
I could get started for us today, Barry.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, first, I'd just like to introduce myself a little bit more. My name is Michael Marty Jr., and I'm from Frog Lake First Nations, as well as the Clean Energy Manager at my nation. And I work on coordinating and champion clean energy projects for my nation. Yeah, during COVID, I was in college for natural resource technology diploma. And during that time, it really hit my school hard and the classes that I really do as halfway through the day, we would go outside to go and, learn on the land. And that's really what this course was about. And when COVID hit, we kind of got forced to, go in front of the Zoom like we are here today. And we began doing classes like that. And we weren't out on the land every day, learning in person, more hands-on. So when that happened, it made things really tough for me as, I'm more of a hands-on learner, and not being out there in the bush learning definitely had its challenges. So during this time, after I was finished school that year, COVID was still into fact, and it was getting worse. So really, I had no choice but to stay home. And during this time, I started to really work on myself and to, take some time for myself, as I went right into college at 17 years old after I graduated. And during my college as well, I had my first child. Her name is Rosalina, who's now 4 years old. And, it was really time for me to work on myself and to watch my baby grow. And something that really helped me was I went back to my roots in my nation, Frog Lake First Nations. And I started to really begin to learn about the ceremonies and the culture and all the important things at the Nehiwiak, which is a Cree person. And it really, healed me in my inside, as, I come from generational trauma, as I'm not too far, maybe a generation away from residential schools in my family. So, there was generational trauma there, and there was things that I had to work on. And being able to go through the ceremonies and, take this year and a half off during the COVID lockdowns to really do this and to really learn my culture and ceremonies so that I can pass it on to the next 7 generations to my.
So you use this as an opportunity to sort of fill in some gaps that you might otherwise not have had time to. Thanks, Michael. Anyone else want to jump in and share with us some of your own personal experiences? Go ahead.
I'd love to jump in on that specifically to do with family. I found that during COVID, I really was able to connect with my family more, and it happened to be that my grandparents decided to come and live with us during this time. And it meant that we simply had more time to hang out with them, me and my brother. And it meant that I had more time to hang out with my own parents as well, where they're working, of course, the 9 to 5, and we were going to school. And so you'd see each other on the weekends and, normal. But this actually meant that we were able to connect more, I believe. And especially when, I mean, for my own schooling experience, the March that school was shut down, uh, until probably, I mean, until that summer, we weren't forced in front of Zoom screens. And so that meant that they were just sending us this work. And then the rest of the time, we were able to hang out with family, go to events, et cetera, et cetera. And it was only when we went back to school that we were forced in front of the Zoom screens again. I found that unnecessary. And it meant that any sort of independence that you had built up or any of those skills of time management were kind of beaten down again, and just wasn't beneficial. But I also found that I was able to, I mean, talking about events that I brought up, I was able to connect with more peers and professionals because I was able to have more time freed up. I was able to go to professional events. I was able to meet a whole different sector of people just simply because I had more time, and finally pursue things a little bit more that now that I had this time management that were extracurricular. So there were some entrepreneurial things I was able to pursue much better. I was able to help out on some of the properties that my family owns. And I found that I was able to take advantage of programs like TKS, which is the Knowledge Society, which is I think it's 13 to 18, where it bring people from all across the world actually. And we were able to connect with like-minded peers who were interested in, because I went to an art school, but I wasn't really interested in the arts. This was an opportunity for me to meet other people that were around actually my age that were interested in innovation and technology and kind of entrepreneurship and etc. So
We'll,
um,
we'll,
I-
we'll, we'll,
yeah.
we'll dive into the entrepreneurship because I think there are some others that have shared that as well. So let's come back to that in a moment. Vivek, what about yourself? How did COVID hit you?
Well, I was actually at the end of middle school. I was in 8th grade when COVID started. So yeah, I was pretty young back then, but I would say that it was a double-edged sword. So for one, we had classes online. I particularly did not like those. And one I vividly remember this one time, uh so our school did this thing where they would like quarantine certain classes if they had like certain cases there, and but then certain classes were like not quarantined. So I actually showed up to class and there were like 4 people in the classroom, and our teacher was also quarantined. So we had to Zoom from inside our school to see our teacher who was at home. And that was just a surreal experience. And I would say that that wasn't that good for the whole learning process. However, as Sophia mentioned, there was a lot of extracurricular development that happened during this time that was aided by the online Zoom activities. For example, I was a huge debater. I know a lot of my friends also did TKS, for instance. And as a debater, what I would do was I would go to debate tournaments all across the world. We did tournaments in Europe, we did tournaments in America, like Harvard, Stanford, all these different tournaments. And that was aided by the ability to have these Zoom tournaments that you normally wouldn't have had before. And this was still before Chat GPT, so the arguments were still like pretty original, and there was a great exchange of thought during this time, I would say. And I met a lot of great people across the world, across the city itself. And I would say one thing that happened actually was there was a great move towards digitization, as if that already hadn't started, but it accelerated under the whole COVID pandemic. And the reason I say this is I had a phone before, but I didn't really use it. And then after COVID, I started to use it more profusely. And I would say that this was enabled. I mean, this is not necessarily a good or bad thing. I'm just saying it's a shift in the whole cultural process of how people interact. I would say that this was aided by the COVID pandemic and the whole lockdown that occurred. And I would say that it's kind of like it flattened the world in a sense. You were able, like before you were friends with only people in your school, now you're friends with everybody in the city, kind of whole perspective.
Okay, thank you. I want to call on Natalie next. Natalie, jump in.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I mean, I'm not, I don't know, youth, my age, I'm 44, so I feel like my experience is going to be really different from some of the youth on the panel. And I owned a business through COVID. I owned a yoga studio. So I had a very unique experience of the pandemic. I was, running a business. It was opened, I was closed, I was holding Zoom classes for yoga throughout the entire thing. I mean, it was really great when the pandemic ended, watching people come into the studio and be together was like, and it just the most amazing experience, the energy that that brought. I would never trade actually the whole experience for that period of time because watching people come back together was so incredible. But I have to be honest in that I felt as a small business owner, the pandemic was really, really hard and not handled well from a regulation standpoint. But I digress. I don't want to get too much into it because I feel like I'm so much more curious about the impact to the people that were more in a growth phase or, the younger generations right now. And it was certainly a wild ride on my part, though.
Okay, well, I'm going to thank you. I mean, I experienced a lot of puzzle making. I lost my grandchildren during that period, but I did a lot of puzzles, and I used to have my grandchildren helping me. So the 3D Eiffel Tower is sitting in the garage today as a memory of that experience. Go ahead, Emerson. What was your experience?
I think mine's a little bit different. I was 28 to 30 during the pandemic, and I was in the UK, where the approach was a little bit different, and we can get back to that later. It was a little bit more permissive, more liberal than Canada was. I think on one hand, and same thing for a lot of peers, it was a really positive time because you're in the middle of work and you're working 16, 18 hours, and your organizations get better because it was a time for certain organizations to recede. And I mean, if it's a physical business like yours, Natalie, that's challenging inherently. But for others that are in the tech space or networking space, geopolitics, it's a time. There were certain organizations that leveled up, so that was a chance for us to do better. And I was doing a PhD at the time, and the PhD might have not finished if the pandemic didn't take place because you're traveling a lot before that, and you just don't have time to work on it. So the pandemic was a forced pause where you could do networking online, but you could actually dedicate time to things that needed to be focused on. So it was positive in that way. I think in hindsight, talking about the one moment that was a challenge, for me, it wasn't during the pandemic, it was a little bit after, where I'm in the relationship business on the geopolitics side. And what I found afterwards is you put 2 years into virtual meetings with new people that you haven't met yet. And you realize, despite years of time put into building these so-called new relationships, you don't know the people until you've actually met them in person.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing for hiring people. You'd hire somebody and you'd think maybe they're 5'7", but it turns out they're 6'4" in person. And they're just a completely different person than what you thought. So it really showed to me the limitations of virtual engagement, that you can think that you're making a lot of progress by putting in long hours and talking with lots of people and writing, over text or email, but you do not know the person until you've actually spent a considerable amount of time with them in person. So that was a big takeaway for me. It wasn't during, it was after, where I realized, wow, we worked all these hours and did okay, but we lost 2 years worth of relationship building, even in a relationship business.
Important point, Emerson. And I think those that did the analysis highlighted that frequently, that the loss of the personal connection maybe wasn't even appreciated till after the fact. Just as my comment about making puzzles and losing contact with my grandchildren. Okay, Rachel, last but not least, what was the impact for you?
Yeah, thanks, Perry. First of all, I have to say, I'm just really interested and encouraged by a lot of the really great and positive comments that came out from the pandemic and the positive attitude. It does occur to me that this particular slice of people is particularly oriented towards having a positive or making the best out of bad circumstances, and maybe also are inherently equipped or enabled to deal with adverse circumstances. For example, I was in that boat. I lived outside of the city during the pandemic, and there was very little change to my day-to-day life. I could go outside when I wanted. I've spent most of my time at home with my family anyway. And in knowing that, it motivated me a lot to work for my team. I worked during the pandemic for the most part with just I think a tiny bit of school, but knowing that, hey, my coworkers might need things like lunch socialization activities, games organized. And so recognizing that, I organized quite a few of those things. But I think sometimes in the way that an injury or a burn like might not register to you right when it happens, I think that downstream, kind of to Emerson's point, maybe to Natalie's point a little bit as well, when you start to look around and look at other problems, like maybe spikes in anxiety that you see in people, spikes in socialization problems, if you look at repopulation rates and why those things are not progressing in the way that they have historically, I think you can kind of start to say, oh, maybe that burn was worse than we thought that it was. And the fact that we handled it well at the time is not the fact that we handled it well at the time is reflective of how bad it was, the magnitude of the difficulty. We rose to that challenge, but there's still a lot of follow-up pieces that have to be dealt with. And that shouldn't just be swept under the rug and as something that, was hard to deal with at the time and nobody knew what they were doing. We have to know what we're doing in the fallout of that so that we don't continue to experience those consequences.
Okay, well, it may be a little early to draw a conclusion. It's apparent from this first go-round that the media may have been overstating the negative implications on youth, at least from this panel's perspective. You made choices. You made positive choices, whether it was Michael and spending time to better understand his culture, or family, or entrepreneurship, or business. What is apparent from each of you is that you were not passive victims to COVID. You took that event rather than as a negative, simply as an event, and you made the best of it. So I'm going to go on to the next question, which is about resilience or recovery, which are really not the same thing. The word resilience is often used to praise how youth adapted during the pandemic, much of what we've talked about to this point. But for some, this can feel like a dismissal of the real damage done. From your perspective, when does resilience become an excuse for ignoring the need for support? That is, did you ignore the fact that maybe something negative was needed and that you simply, being positive people, ignored it, maybe picked it up later? What would genuine recovery look like for you or your peers? And maybe the focus is maybe on your peers where you did see people going through a negative. I'm not going to call on all of you, or we'll overabuse and abuse time and not get to the Q&A. So I'm just going to randomly ask Natalie, because you saw a number of people. Did you see evidence of people that were really struggling and get a sense of what recovery for them might mean?
Yeah, it was really like as much as it was amazing to watch people come together in the first year after the pandemic in the space, it was very clear to me that when I reopened my doors and the mandates were lifted, that people had been traumatized. So how people were entering the space, how people were interacting with it, and sort of the legacy of the pandemic was really apparent. And, just even in terms of like eye contact or willingness to have a conversation, the space that people would have between each other. What's been cool is that I don't feel it like it's like that anymore. So I still, although I sold my studio, I still teach there, and it feels totally normal, but it did take, I'm going to say it took at least a year, maybe longer, before I started to feel some normalcy with people. And maybe the other thing that I'll just point to is like in owning a yoga studio, really you're holding a community. And that means that you have people with all sorts of different views inside that community. And there was an inherent tension for a really long time afterwards, just with people not part of what was so difficult about having people start conversations with each other was a trepidation about what that other person's perspective might be because of the polarization.
Yeah.
So I really could feel that.
I think that was often brought to my attention, having contact with a tutoring agency, and which of course is receiving students who probably were struggling the most, but that lack of socialization, the number of years, 2 years that passed by without having a lot of contact with their peers, younger kids. Rachel, what about those that you may have seen?
Um, this might not be exactly what you want to hear, but I'm a lot more confident in people's ability to recover for something like this than I am about the economy. I think I'm not so much depressed about people and that kind of resilience as I am about the fact that cauliflower is like $8 and I may never buy a house now. That kind of leads to its own kind of depression as opposed to oh, we didn't socialize really well for a couple of years. I think that if I was more confident that those things were going to be resolved well, I would have a much more hopeful perspective. Of course, not saying that it's not hopeful. And I think as an entrepreneur, you choose to say, okay, well, that's the future I'm going to try to make for myself and others.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter how steep the incline is. But I think that to me is the more depressive element.
Michael, did you see the impact of your peers in getting any sense of the recovery from the isolation and the time spent away?
Yeah, for sure. I think, as I spent a lot of time in ceremony, what I noticed during COVID is we lost a lot of our young people and our young generation coming to this ceremony and learning these valuable lessons that, we need to carry on to make sure that our ceremonies and our culture lasts on for generations.
Mhm.
And back in the day before COVID hit, we used to have ceremonies with a lot of people in there, and once COVID kind of came and left, we were kind of left with a handful of people now. And not to mention we lost a lot of important people like our knowledge keepers and our elders who held on to some very important information. So I guess you could say a lot of some of our ceremonies and our teachings also got lost in that. And we also lost a lot of our young people coming out to these lodges as they didn't really know where to go and they didn't feel safe going anywheres. So that's kind of what I seen from my peers as well as a little bit of the older generations.
Okay, so where a community may have been fragile and needing sustained support, whether it be family or community in the sense of culture, that break from continuity has had some lasting impact. Emerson, anything you want to add here?
I don't have much personal experience on this front. I was back at the University of Alberta a few months ago, and I was talking with some profs, and they said something that's really stuck with me, that they've noticed a qualitative change in students that were, I guess, in high school during the pandemic versus those that weren't, where they noticed that university now is the new high school. And this is just across the board, and that things that should have been taught in university or in high school are now the responsibility of professors that just don't have the time for, teaching certain elements of socialization. They find in office hours that students don't spend as much time, going through the diplomatic elements of a conversation. How are you? It's just more, you get into office hours and it's, what's the answer to this question? It's very direct, almost text-based. And they say this is just across the board. And I was really struck by that, thinking how annoying this is overall for many people, because lack of social time in high school, universities don't have the capacity for this, profs don't have the time for this, so that's a challenge. I mean, in terms of your question on how to respond to this, I think it's just people need to probably get out there and adventure and travel as much as they can to catch up on social time. That's probably the only solution.
Sorry, Emerson, to your point though, I'm really curious about how much of that is also compounded by AI in the school system right now.
Yeah,
it's probably a mix. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, AI provide, well, Sophia, you want to add anything here?
Sorry, I work in STEM ed tech. Let me just say that's probably why.
You and Sophia maybe have similar experiences to share. Sophia, go ahead.
Something, and then I'm gonna go on answer the question a little bit more. It was interesting how, I mean, going off of Emerson's point, I mean, when we were doing, I mean, it was really strange because for the schooling, they kept going back and forth on the different styles of online that they were trying to do. And after a while, I just decided to go to a program we have in Edmonton called Argyle, where it was just purely asynchronous. But when they were going back and forth, and then they were sending us videos to learn from instead of actually being there, and et cetera, it was a very interesting time. But for kids that couldn't time manage or work alone because of age, so the K to 6, I think really struggled during this time, or because of other factors. And so that included even like my age bracket. There was a lot of folks that just weren't showing up. I know that there was one of my classes where the teacher was saying that 3 people had actually turned in an assignment and one of them was blank. So, and this was out of a class of, I mean, during COVID, because it was online, classes could be up to like, I remember one of my classes was 50 to like 55 students in it. And like, it was just insane because part of also during COVID, when you had options, the options weren't actually coming from your school. So there was this weird kind of like hybrid between all the schools that were happening. And so some classes would just be filled to the max with kids, and teachers just couldn't handle that. So that was very strange. But actually going off of the tutoring as well, if we are thinking of, I know part of the question was for the recovery. I think that because a lot of students, I don't remember the exact number, but I remember during COVID, there was just a lot of students that just weren't showing up during the in-person times, but also during the online times, people just wouldn't come to class. And I think tutoring, either funding towards tutoring or adding tutoring to insurance policies would be really beneficial, and that would help a lot of kids recuperate, especially that K to 6, where they just missed a portion of that. And then even possibly for what Emerson was talking about, for the folks that are going into university and missing a part of that, or in high school now, and they're missing some of that education. I think that would be really interesting just for recovery and helping with the success educational wise.
Vivek, any points you want to make regarding recovery options?
I largely think that we have recovered from the pandemic as a whole in terms of our mental perspective. But as Rachel said, it's a lot of the economic factors that do bring stress to us. The economy has fundamentally changed in the last 5 years, whether it be inflation, housing, and all of that. I think that that is something that is very worrying to our generation. And I also think that the labor market, the fact that jobs are very hard to come by these days, is another growing pain point. But I'd say COVID overall, I would say that yes, that did have its effects, but it was largely temporary in its effect. And the reason for, and possibly it's different. Maybe my experience might not completely reflect this, but I'd say that it mainly just led to more digitization of communication, which allowed for larger networks of like communication between people. So like I wasn't just limited to people in my school now. I was all across the city. I knew everybody in like the major schools across the city. And I would say that yes, there was a lot of things that we had to, I would say it's probably the people who are a little bit older than me who didn't have that high school experience, but I, like people my age, largely had the high school experience, and people still meet in person a lot. There is a lot of people who like stay at home, but I'd say that it's like a bifurcation. There's a large population of people who like to go outside and spend time still, and then there's a large population of people who want to spend time inside and not really socialize. And I think that maybe that's exacerbated a little bit. But largely, I think that recovery in terms of COVID, the mental perspective, all of that has largely happened.
Well, the segment of the population that clearly we've neglected from this session is those in that K to 6. I think, Vivek, you were the youngest in grade 8 at the time. So where the hangover may be most evident would be among those kids that need to be encouraged to socialize, preteens. The next question, we're privileged to have Emerson here, who was not in Canada at the time. You were over in Great Britain, and I'd like to compare Canada to the world with the question: Sweden kept schools open. Finland invested in post-pandemic education. Australia rolled out national youth recovery programs. Canada largely left the recovery to the provinces. We've touched a little bit about how self-help seems to have played a role. Based on your experience, do you think Canada's response failed youth? And if so, how? What specific policy or program would you want to see implemented now to make up for lost time? We've touched on a little bit of that now, but Emerson, I'm going to let you take the ball on this one. Go ahead.
Sure. So I thought the UK response was good. So one of the main things I learned about the difference between Canada on one hand and the UK and the US on the other in the pandemic is Canadians, we value order, peace, order, good government. And on the UK side and the US side, it's about freedom. So on the UK side, it was really funny with the guidance because the government put out this guidance, but nobody listened to it and nobody enforced it because the view of Brits is we don't like rules. And when there are rules, we interpret them as using our critical thinking, and we'll adopt a muddling through pragmatic approach. That's just the British approach on these things. And I think that's why there wasn't a lot of polarization on the British side, is the mentality of the government. And Boris Johnson, who's a liberal, who really, even though he was prime minister and people wanted to protect the NHS, he didn't want these lockdowns. His view was, we'll do what we need to do to appease certain people, but we're not going to enforce anything. So actually, it worked out pretty well. And Britain got out of the lockdown about a year before Canada, and things got back to normal. And people would joke with each other in stores, we don't know what the rules are. Half the people had their masks on, half of them didn't, but nobody cared. So that was good, I thought. And that's more of a European approach, I think, in general. It's just, people are more relaxed on this typically than Canadians are. On the Canadian side, I found, and this was evident from the very start, from the first weeks, we value order, we value government, capital PH, public health. Whatever doctors say or governments say is gospel. And I think that's a problem because amongst most Canadians, there's just a lack of critical thinking, of judgment in general, and we want to be comfortable and complacent and sort of looked after. So I think it's a cultural issue on the Canadian side that I think requires a lot of time to change. And if maybe there's one benefit from the pandemic, it's that young people went through this and saw that this didn't work in terms of the top-down approach, and maybe people keep that with them long-term, and it leads to a bit of a cultural change in how we think about order in general. So maybe that's something positive that comes out of it.
Well, I mean, it's clear that media certainly enjoyed the conflict between those that felt that free expression was being compromised by masking and mandates. So the media certainly portrayed the intensity of angst that existed within the culture. Anyone else want to jump in here? Otherwise, I'll get to the wrap-up question, then we can get to the Q&A.
Well, and just one other quick thing. It's no surprise that these trucker protests happen in Canada. You think, where are these resistance movements likely to happen? They're likely to happen in places where there's a very top-down, orderly approach,
right? Because
people get annoyed. So it's the more permissive societies where I think you won't see that kind of stuff happening because there's just no need for it.
I want to say even there, it felt like there was a double standard because when a lot of the rioting was covered in the US, there was no mention of that was freedom of speech. That was a totally acceptable form of freedom of speech that if you were to take away the reasoning played out in very similar social ways, everyone was outside, people were gathered together, throw out the more disruptive elements even. If you were just looking at it from a policy standpoint to say, okay, like, is this a safety issue or not? The fact that the standards were applied and that the coverage by the media was so disparate for two technically similar modalities of being outside and gathering was odd. I was fairly displeased with that, at least in Canada. I just thought it was weird. It added insult to injury somehow.
I think we're going to revisit this topic frequently over the course of the series, just because media and the differences that appear in that public versus private impact seem to show up over and over again. The evolution of AI, just another example. Okay, well, let's jump into the follow-up, the final question, from isolation to innovation. And a number of you have already indicated that you got focused and you took an entrepreneurial initiative as a consequence. So, despite all the challenges, some youth used the pandemic as a launchpad to create, to organize, to lead. Do you see this period as one that fractured youth potential or forged it in new ways? And I know some of you, by way of example, forged it in new ways. Can you share a moment when you or someone you know turned disruption into something meaningful? Natalie, I'm going to call on you first, and then I'm going to end with Sophia. Go ahead, Natalie.
Well, I mean, there were a lot of people that lost businesses during COVID. I was able to use my business as a way to reunite people after the pandemic. And, you know, we did well, actually, which is very lucky because there's obviously these small businesses took on a lot of debt just to survive the closures. Um, so someone approached me, offered to buy my business about a year ago, which was exciting for me. And since then, I've been more involved politically. I was a little bit disgruntled with how the government handled the mandates and the impact to my business. So I got involved politically because of it, which I think for me has been the right move and has been a way to like forge a new path forward that I feel really good about, and I feel like I can be a contribution in a different way. So it's been an interesting evolution for me personally.
Thank you, Rachel, and then I'll call on Michael. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, sorry, the I think
Innovation and creativity. I
yeah,
know.
thank you. There's been a lot, and I think that AI, at least from what I've seen in my industry, AI has driven a lot of that. The fact that people were already in isolation, the fact that AI came out during a period of isolation, and I don't want to say forced, but let's say created the circumstances that would drive people to AI more frequently than they might have used it otherwise because they were already isolated. Um, I think that it had some negative impacts, kind of as I touched on with the comment with Emerson. I do think that it drove a lot of creativity, and I have to say it drove a lot of work. I think that most people have a fight or flight instinct when it comes to this kind of stuff. And if you are a fighter, and if you are the kind of person who's going to say, I'm not going to sit here and let this happen to me, you will find a way to take those tools and resources and do something about it. Very encouraging to see so many people on the panel like that. And like I said, in STEM education technology, I saw a lot of that. At the same time, it took out our business. The business that I was working at the time, they are kind of on the verge of being disrupted. So I would say that my perspective on all of it is that while the opportunity was there, opportunity doesn't knock on everybody's door equally, and it doesn't come to everybody at the same time, and everybody doesn't react the same way. For the people who weren't able to take advantage of it, I think that they suffered a lot more than people who were able to take advantage of it have gained, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and for the audience, the industry that you're referring to is ed tech, which clearly prospered during COVID, and when COVID was over, seems to have collapsed. And many of the opinion that it didn't do what it promised to do. In fact, it got exposed. Michael, anything you want to share in terms of entrepreneurial initiative? I know your world is clean tech.
Yeah, of course. So around the end of the pandemic, a job opportunity came up in my community as the clean energy coordinator. And, coming from an environmental background in my post-secondary, I was always wondering, what can I bring back to my nation, what that can be important. And currently in my nation, we have around almost 500 oil wells going on up in our community, which is, very detrimental to the environment. And not only that, but our people, as all these toxic fumes that come from the oil is, affecting our people, affecting our children, our animals. And, I wanted to see change in my community. And, I was thinking about innovative and creative ways on how I can make that change. And this job opportunity came to me. Funny enough, I was almost pulled into going to go work in the oil and gas industry, but this job opportunity came up, and I decided to turn that down, and I went towards this path because I knew, I wanted to protect the environment and not destroy it any more further. So there's our counselor in our nation, Clifton Cross, who has came up with this great, amazing idea, innovative, creative, everything in between about how we can change our nation for the better. And he brought me along because as I got accepted into the position, and I guess you can say the rest is history. It's been 3 years now that I've been in this position. I've obviously moved up to clean energy manager now. And, we've been doing amazing things. Like, I know early on I had to do a lot of learning and capacity building and putting myself out there as, after COVID, I didn't really do much of that in between that. So it was really, getting outside of my comfort zone again to meet with these people and, to go ask those hard questions that I can bring back to my community.
Well,
And now,
we certainly saw it with Cross, and you're an example of it, how COVID really triggered what I call economic reconciliation. I've been out there and seen the energy that has followed after COVID. Emerson, you want to add anything? And then Vivek?
I mean, to me, the opportunity that comes out of this is similar to what I said earlier. It's that people become a little bit more critical in thinking about government mandates.
Yeah.
And I hope that young people can keep that with them as we go forward.
It'll be interesting to see this generation as it reaches leadership age and whether or not the COVID carries on and what they learn about public policy and the impact on individuals. Vivek, that's an opening for you.
Well, I think that in the aftermath of COVID, we did see a lot of political shifts, a lot of a shift in the broader perspective of the public. It wasn't just that, yes, the future is going to continue getting better forever, as we always thought before, kinda. But now we kind of entered into more of a fearful time period where there's crises everywhere. And I think even if, as I said before, we might have recovered from COVID, what we haven't recovered from is that whole fearful mindset that pervades all of society as of right now, and is probably only getting worse, as we can see with events on the news as of recent. And I think that that is one of the great shifts that took place. But within great changes, I think that there lies great opportunities all the time. And I think that, yes, during COVID, for instance, there were a lot of my peers who took advantage of this period. Like, I even tried to do stuff during COVID, other than my extracurriculars. Like, for instance, me and my friends, we got together and we wanted to launch a YouTube channel because we were all sitting at home doing nothing of value. And we were like, well, how can we do something online and possibly make an impact online? And then, like, another one of my friends was, okay, what if we can take in-person events that we did in, like, beforehand, it was like this whole Model UN thing. How can we turn that into something online? How can we digitize all of this? And a lot of innovation happened on that digital front. But then after COVID, I would say that a lot that kind of tapered out. Nobody really wants to be in digital events all the time. They prefer being in in-person events. But the like Zoom meetings, for instance, they became more commonplace, while we still prefer in-person meetings. A lot of the times, the digital aspect can increase the efficiency of a lot of these operations. So entrepreneurship has become both hybrid. It's both digital and in person now. Whereas during COVID, yeah, it mainly tilted towards the digital side of things. And beforehand, it was probably more in person. But now we've really just like synced the two worlds after the whole COVID crisis ended.
So your interest in youth and policy formulation is apparent as the leader of the Calgary Youth Policy Council. So we'll hear more about that body over time. Sophia, you want to wrap it up? Any concluding observations you want to share?
Yeah, I think all of us kind of go around the same sort of ideas with different examples and maybe some conflicting ideas. But I think for those who appreciated the time and the time management and the independence that they were given, they're able to find a lot of opportunity. And I think a lot of companies and people that took and ran with just the onlineness of it all and the different tools like AI that were coming up, were really able to benefit. And that was companies and individuals that were able to benefit. Also during this time, personally, I was able to just dedicate more time to extracurriculars, like Key Angels, where I was able to support folks with access and financial and just I was able to pursue a lot of just other personal interests, and I appreciated that independence. And I think many other youth did as well. But I do think that it encouraged and would amplify the independence and proactivity for youth, that there were some who just didn't have these skills, who weren't able to take advantage of it, whether because they're K to 6 or for other reasons. And that potentially did make a divide between those two groups. But I think, like Vivek said, as we've come back over time, maybe it's come a little bit, maybe it's that divide isn't as apparent anymore. But I think it was an interesting time that just encouraged independence and a lot of just interesting flexibility.
Thank you. Thank you, panel. We've got about 15 minutes for a Q&A. I'm going to start out with Peter McKinnon, who's championed viewing these events as part of a poly crisis. Peter, any questions you want to ask of the panel?
Well, thank you, Perry. And first off, I think the panel is excellent. I really enjoyed all of your comments. I thought they were very insightful and well presented. So I do have a question I was wondering about, because this happened to me, and I'd be very interested in your answers if you wish to do so as individuals or as a group. First off, I said great contributions from each of the speakers. I'm wondering from your descriptions if during the pandemic, your enjoyment of work or enjoyment of working increased or even became more diversified, including meeting new people, such as some of you have said. And I would appreciate if you have any views on that. It sounds from what you've all spoken that you're very entrepreneurial in the sense you seize the opportunity to do something positively for yourself and others. I'm just wondering, though, how you see this in this context of my question. Thank you.
Anybody want to jump in there? Emerson?
I'm happy to comment on the geopolitics question a bit later, but on this question on work, no difference on my side. I mean, to me, work is work, and you just need to adapt to whatever the circumstances are.
I mean, I think it's kind of like asking if you enjoy having like leg after your leg gets chopped off because you can run faster now. Would I rather have my original leg? Yes. Is it still cool to have a bionic leg and be able to run fast? Also, yes.
I think I really appreciated the control and independence that it gave me over my education, as well as being able to start working and being able to actually, one thing I found really interesting was because I was able to turn my camera off and suddenly everything was through email, nobody knew my age. So there was nothing it was truly, everything was based off of merit and just how people perceived you through either text or just how you were talking. So that was really interesting. I appreciated what online was able to contribute to what I was wanting to do.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And
Hey, Natalie, did you want to say anything?
oh, yeah, sure.
Go ahead, Judith.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that, yeah, I largely agree with what everybody said. But one thing I'd say is I prefer in-person meetings more so. I don't really like online meetings that much. So I would say one of the benefits that happened because of the pandemic was that I was able to access more opportunities that because of the fact that they were online, I could attend them from my home. But then again, I also felt that I couldn't really fulfill a lot of these to my best of abilities because I operate better in person where I can actually like read people, not just through a screen. So and I like doing things that involve people. So I think that made a difference. But then again, I also think that Sophia had a very good point about the whole merit. Like, yeah, like I had a friend, he was 14, actually he was younger than 14, and he started his own marketing company and sold it for 6 figures. And nobody knew that it was a 13-year-old making advertisements for boxing stadiums. So there really is a lot of things that changed because of that and a lot of merit that came to the front, I guess.
Okay, Yogi, you often have an overview perspective. You got a question for the panel here?
I sure do. I think during COVID, we all observed a huge influx of ridiculous commentary, conspiracy theory, distrust of government, agitation on social media. It's just wild. And I think that was disorienting to quite a few adults, and some of them got sucked into the nonsense as well as got sucked into the nonsense. So I wonder about the youth. Were they similarly disoriented or agitated, or did they tune it out and listen to music or something else?
Almost, and I wonder if it differed across countries, such as what Emerson was alluding to. Emerson, you want to pick that up? It almost has a geopolitical element to it.
Well, in terms of, I can't comment as well as Vivek or Rachel or others who are younger in terms of how this disoriented people. I noticed, some friends went off the rails, but I think those people had those leanings already. If people were a little bit on the extreme side, it just kind of made them a bit crazier, and unfortunately, they just went off the rails. But that's just a small group of friends. In terms of the geopolitics side, just going to what Peter had said a little bit earlier, and this is on the topic of negativity of things getting worse. And Yitong was saying this in the pre-chat just before this started, and I don't have any particular theory on this. It's just a observation. The pandemic was a real divide between, like, it was a policy decision from government that was real. It actually affected our lives, and you saw clearly that there were people that wanted a lockdown and didn't want a lockdown. So this division was visceral. Then a few years later, and so that created divides between people. Then a few years later, there's Russia-Ukraine, another kind of divide. Then a few years after that, there's Israel-Gaza, which is a different kind of divide on religious, ethnic lines, and who knows what else is going to happen. But there has been something since the pandemic where I've found conflict has become much less theoretical and much more real, where people have experienced it, and lines have started to be created based on different categories, from risk tolerance, again on the pandemic side, to democracies, authoritarian states, to religious lines. What you think about your views on anti-Semitism or whatever, there's been a step-by-step approach there, and that is concerning. So that's been a sort of clear but nebulous result that maybe doesn't come from the pandemic, but the pandemic has maybe expedited it.
Well, that's very interesting because, I mean, it's not new that we've had a right wing and a left wing view, a Democrat and Republican, or a conservative versus liberal. So that bifurcation of society has existed for some time, but something has happened to the moderate. What has become a silent, either whether it's a silent minority or a silent majority. The precursor to COVID was, of course, climate change, where you had that divisiveness.
Sorry,
Okay.
I just want to really quickly jump off of Emerson's point, which is that, and also to Yogi's question, which is that the fallout and the policy and the things that we had to do during COVID were real. And tying that to that essentially means that we couldn't ignore what was going on, even if you wanted to. And I think that maybe where, at least for me, some of the dissonance came in is when you were kind of being told to ignore the literal things that you were seeing. When you go into, to Sophia's point, if you change policies on how you're dealing with COVID once every 2 to 3 weeks or once every month, you've got to know that COVID was real and it functioned in some way. So if your policies changed consistently on how you were dealing with it, there's no way that all of those were effective. And beyond that, if you see kids who are playing musical instruments with 2/3 of the mask cut out, somehow you're sending the message that this policy is not as meaningful or useful because I can see with my eyes that it's clearly not protecting anyone in the way that you're telling me that it's going to protect someone. So I think for me at that point, it's kind of, I'm going to have to come to my own conclusions. I'm going to have to take in all the possible information that I can and come out with a good decision and hope that that turns into a policy that creates a Canada that I want to live in post-COVID now.
That's a very interesting point, Rachel, one I don't think we can ignore, and that is maybe youth didn't pay a lot of attention to some of the broad global issues, but COVID brought it home. It couldn't be ignored. The mandates were clear, and the institutions that were supporting that mandate, whether it be schools or businesses closing down or governments providing paychecks or otherwise, they were caught in the sweep. Okay, we've got a few more minutes left. I'm looking for Vivek. Vivek, you're back. Any points you want to make here?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I would say that to address Yogi's point about the widespread government distrust and things, I would say that there was a progressive evolution. I would say that when COVID initially started, there was very high trust in the government. In fact, it was like everybody followed without question about like what was happening, like what the government policy was. Everybody would follow without question. But then I would say that once everybody moved on more digitally, especially people my age, there was a huge bifurcation of the population into like politically radicalized camps. And then I would say the next phase of that, as we move into say 2023, so I'd say 2022 was like the peaking of this polarization period, where it was, and it was, I would say there was a lot, largely, there was also a period of censorship here. But I would say that while we move into 2023, what happened was that there started to be, especially amongst people in my generation, I'd say, there was a more, I don't want to term it a conservative shift, but there was a shift rightward compared to the traditional drift towards more left, well, like not left, more liberal ideas as we move forward, like the whole continuous progress notion that we are continuously progressing. I think that that kind of shifted, and I think that, yeah, to Yogi's point, with like the whole media algorithms, Instagram, Reels, TikTok, all of that, I think that there has been a mainstreaming of like the whole conspiracy theories, et cetera, that has been occurring. And it's especially prevalent in our generation. Oh, well, at least my like 2+2 -2 year age group people, I would say that that has largely taken place. And I would say that now we are in a period where there is a large scale distrust of the government in some sense, but there is uh but there's also a large portion of people who still like there's still a large portion of people who believe in the government and think that, yeah, what they're doing is correct. But there's also a large population that now is like, okay, we're on the fence about what you guys are doing.
Interesting. Very interesting. You raised AI. Randall, you've got a point you want to make there, or a question you'd like to raise?
Well, this has been a very enlightening conversation and more optimistic, positive than I had anticipated. But we do have a select group of youths here who are also very bright, innovative, entrepreneurial, and but it is encouraging because many in our group won't even be here in 10 years, won't be on this planet. But these are the people who are building our future together and their own future. In fact, they, in a sense, own the future more than we do. But I'm wondering about what scares our young panelists most about the world is going.
Okay, so he's raised the fear element. The word fear has emerged. I forget whether it was Vivek or but someone along the course of this discussion has indicated the perpetuation of fear, and that's a little bit of what Randall is playing into. Natalie, you might be seeing it from your perspective. Do you see this as a carry-on?
Yeah, I think the lack of shared reality is actually what concerns me the most. It's not necessarily even what's actually happening, it's that there's no agreement. And I think that that causes a fair amount of chaos. So that's what I'm most concerned about.
Sorry, Randall, I gotta jump in. I just think fear's for people who aren't gonna do anything about it. Like, what's the point of being afraid at this point? Like, we're gonna be here in 10 years. We're gonna live in the future, and being afraid of it isn't gonna help us to deal with it any better. Maybe that's a trauma response, or maybe that's just in terms of being afraid. I don't know. I don't know if that's the tack that I would tend to take there.
All right.
Well, we're into wrap up. I'm going to ask any of the panelists whether they'd like to make any concluding observations, and then I'll wrap it up. Let's start with Emerson. Emerson, I called on you next to last, but
Sure.
any concluding comments you want to make?
I'll say I agree with what you just said, Natalie. I think I'm really worried that there's people that live in alternative, or everybody has their own fact base now, and this is becoming more apparent as time goes on, and it's very worrisome because it actually makes it hard to have conversations with people. But I'd say even more deeply, people have completely different senses of ethics, if they even have ethics or a clear sense of values or norms. These things are diverging a lot.
But
So that's a challenge. The other thing I'd say is we're moving towards more conflict between, which is based on U.S.-China relations, and it's a question of, do we see conflict in the short term? Is it in 40 or 50 years? But there's a heating up there, and everybody else is caught in that. So those are my two concerns.
sorry, I'm very passionate on the concept of fear. I just think if you're not afraid to have that conversation with somebody who's different than you, doesn't that open the door to the kind of similarity, even if it's a little difficult at front and you feel strongly and they feel strongly? Isn't not being afraid of having the conversation the first step to getting back to a place where we can all talk about it and agree again?
I think it is. The issue is people can have those conversations, but their social norms might differ. So people might not respond in the same ways afterwards. And when I say respond, I mean, do people respond with civility, decency, kindness, the kinds of things that we have typically prided ourselves on in the West? Those are things that I see eroding. So you can have those conversations, but I'm less confident now than I was even 5 years ago or 10 years ago that those conversations will lead to sustained productive relations across difference. That's my qualification.
That plays into something I'm concerned about, is the depersonalization of conversation through protest. The depersonalization of conversation through protest. It's one thing to protest as a public conversation. It's another thing to have that on an individual basis. And it seems to me there's a propensity right now for people, either with frustration or because they can get away with it, wearing masks, etc., and engaging in violence as a form of conversation. It seems to me that there's a segment of society that seems to feel very comfortable in protesting it leading to violence, as opposed to protesting as part of a democratic public conversation. But we'll get into that later. Natalie, you want to pass on any concluding conversation or comment?
Yeah, I just think that you can be concerned about things and not be afraid and not have a solution. And I think that those are all, possible things to be going on at the same time. So, I get like words get convoluted, just like concepts, just like even physical reality and the place that people are at right now as a result of what really amplified during the pandemic. I think it was already there with like Trump, with climate change. There was already some polarization happening. Is really I would like to find a way to get back to a single sense of truth or narrative for most people. And I don't see a pathway there right now.
Yeah, well, I wonder where that moderate bridge building leadership will come from, because right now leadership seems to be getting louder on each end as opposed to seeking unity. Vivek, any concluding comments you'd like to share?
Well, I would say that we can't let fear dictate our future. So I think that that's important, as Rachel said. And but I also do believe that we have to be wary of this time. There are things that we have to fix, such as the economy, which is people's ultimate baseline. There might be all these identity crises and everything, but if the bottom falls out, that is going to cause real problems. So I think that that is something that we have to be concerned about and take steps to address the economy, the labor problems, and the whole thing that is arriving with artificial intelligence, which is going to be a large change to the workforce. And yes, I believe that we are in a period of great change, and we have to come up with the solutions to address all of those.
Michael, your turn. Any concluding or final comments you'd like to make? Going once? Michael may not be with us anymore. Sophia, you get the final word.
Well, I think the what I'd like to end with is I hope that after COVID, that potentially there's a little bit more reflection from things like the school system in growing their programs like Argyle, and that Alberta, especially, even though there's been this call for innovation for quite a while now. I mean, at least for my lifetime, there's always been this like Alberta Innovates, trying to diversify Alberta into getting into innovation and technology and everything, even though they've cut their funding this year, going towards innovation and things like that. I'm just hoping that we maybe reflect a little bit more on COVID and have a little bit more of a future outward look to support technology, as well as the education and some of the things that benefited youth during COVID, like things like Argyle, and that supported independence and people getting into careers and etc. for the youth under 18 and up to 25 or whatnot.
Well, thank you. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Sophia, Emerson, Natalie, Marty, Rachel, and Vivek. It's been extraordinary. This has exceeded my expectations today. So thank you for episode 1. As we move to episode 2 next Thursday, the editorial this week will be on coddling, crippling, and recovery. We'll be focusing on not just the family and how the family has evolved or not, and the role of education and the role of society at large, providing a degree of protection to ensure that as children grow, they are safe. There's such a thing as overdoing it, overprotection. In my own experience in my career, it was spent in time with people with developmental disabilities that were being denied developmental opportunities, which seemed to be fueling the very problem that they had through institutionalization, which provided a form of overprotection and denial of life's experiences. So that will be the subject of discussion next week.